Good evening, everyone. My name is Patrick Dunn. I use he, him pronouns, and I am the executive director here at the New Haven Pride Center. Hello from my office. We are super excited that you're joining us for one of our mini Pride 2021 panels and conversations. Tonight's program, well, no, it's not panel, it's more of a conversation. Tonight's conversation is Bi Plus Talks. And we will have a little announcement in a little bit about what that means and how that fits into a larger programming we have to announce tonight. But with that said, I do want to just remind everyone that today's program is part of Pride New Haven, which launched yesterday. And will take place as of yesterday all the way through next Sunday, the 19th. We hope to see you at many more of our events. Many are virtual like this one. And then we have also a bunch of really fun in-person programs. And you can see all of those programs at newhavenpridecenter.org/2021 Pride. We also want to take a moment to thank our amazing co-producer, Gotham City/Empire Entertainment Group, and all of our presenting sponsors of Pride New Haven, which include the Community Foundation for Greater New Haven, Stop and Shop, the City of New Haven Department of Arts, Culture, and Tourism, the State of Connecticut Department of Economic and Community Development, Gilead, and Healthcare Advocates International. Lastly, before we start and get to much more interesting topics, we would like to also say and thank all of the incredible volunteers and staff that make Pride possible, and thank all of you for being here to celebrate Pride with us. All of the work of Pride is done through the thanks to the tireless efforts of the staff, more than 100 volunteers, all of our incredible artists and speakers. So if you are feeling extra generous, we welcome donations of support to support this incredible work of Pride and the New Haven Pride Center. You can make donations at newhavenpridecenter.org, or you can go to Venmo or Cash App, and we are just our name on there, so easy to find. Anyway, with that said, I'm going to stop chatting because nobody came to hear me. We are here to talk to Joshua O'Connell, who I'm going to bring onto the screen. Hey, Josh.
Hello. How are you today?
I'm lovely. How are you?
Can't complain.
So I'm going to do like a little intro for you, Josh, but then I'll let you actually do an intro for yourself. But Josh has been a member of the board and a volunteer of the Pride Center for basically since founding, 16 years, I think, Josh?
We're getting close to 16 years, yeah.
16 years. He's currently sits as the president of our board for 3 more weeks. And then he will be stepping down, although still staying involved. And he's also been an incredible champion of Bi Plus programming here at the center, along with some incredible local activists. And I do want to give Sherry a big shout out. I'm sure she is watching. And she's a big champion with Josh of a lot of our programming here at the center. I do want to do a small disclaimer. If you see me looking over to this side randomly, I'm also producing today. So I have 2 hats on. And so I'm not being weird and looking away. I'm just making sure nothing weird is happening.
Yeah, I got a second screen over here too. So if you see me looking over here, it's so I don't miss on a few notes I had for today as well.
But Josh, I'll let you actually introduce yourself in case I missed anything that's vitally important for you to say.
Yeah, no, I mean, I started volunteering for the center in 2006, and I've been around consistently ever since. And sort of what I've done and supported has evolved, but I've really been observing and trying to make sure that we're doing a great job at the center with our Bi Plus programming as we continue to expand in all sorts of different ways, in part because there's a lot of community centers that put LGBT in their name or in what they support, but the B portion, like unfortunately a lot of parts of our community, get missed. And so, you know, the financial support might be there from the community, but then the programming and the tools and the resources don't follow. And so, you know, that's one thing that Patrick and I have both talked about very heavily amongst ourselves, amongst other members of the community who are as active as we try to be on these topics, and you know, want to make sure that we're not only offering resources, but continuing to think about how we can improve things. And so that's part of that announcement we're going to be talking about in a bit. But that includes, just to be transparent, this event where we had a different initial plan and it fell through, and we weren't going to participate in bi erasure of our own Pride Week. So we decided we would have this chat and also make the announcement of what's coming ahead, so that way we could still ensure that there was a place for the bi plus community, still talk about some of the issues that are important, but also preview what's going to be to come. So that's part of why I'm here today and why I'm excited to be here, even though that wasn't the original plan, but I'm absolutely happy to be here nonetheless.
Well, and I want to say for all of our viewers that a big portion of this program tonight, in its original vision, was about specifically talking about bi erasure within the community, right? There's a lot of bi erasure outside the community. Josh, unfortunately, experienced this earlier today, filling out his survey where, it was a series of check boxes, and I think they had every letter of the LGBTQ, all of the letters around it, but B was missing. And you had to use the other box, right? And it's to me, it's crazy to think that that's still so common, right? But it happens externally, but it also happens in our community. And so that's why I want to ground us with that really the original intent of this space, as it continues to evolve, not just this evening, is about really taking a look at bi erasure within the community, because it's one of the things you and I talk about a lot. It's one of the things Sherry Lucas, who's gotten already one call out, we talk about that a lot. There are a lot of uncomfortable conversations that we have to have in our community all the time, and I think Sherry very rightfully, and you have also done this, brought it to me, and it's like sometimes we make mistakes as a community within ourselves, right? We are not very good at having these conversations sometimes. And people take it very personally when you try to have the conversation. So hopefully as we continue to explore this kind of bi plus talks concept in the coming year, as I just committed to you before we jumped on, we can continue to create brave spaces, to quote my friend Kimura, that can begin to break down some of this erasure within the community.
Absolutely. And what was interesting about the example, so just to elaborate a bit, earlier today I was sent a request to take a survey. Wasn't an LGBTQ focused survey, but it was a survey just to get the pulse of something going on in a local community, put together by a university. And when they got to do you identify as, what was interesting was they had gender-based identities, but then they also had other types of identities. So they had, trans man, they had gay, they had lesbian, but you had all of these different things. They got to non-binary, asexual. Really interesting that they had some of the ones that were on there, and I was kind of impressed. But then I got to the bottom of the list, and bisexual, pansexual wasn't present. And I thought that was an interesting oversight, given how inclusive they were aiming to be with that question. But it's not unusual, unfortunately. And when you talk about things like bi erasure, it runs the gamut from people thinking it's a phase to people thinking that you're just undecided. Those of you who are in the bi plus community, I'm preaching to the choir, right? Like, you all have heard this, you all have seen this, you've all dealt with it yourself. You've had people make bad assumptions about who you are. And so, I think it's important. And I think it's interesting, like, if we take a step back and think about like gender identity and, for instance, your pronouns, people have to break through assumptions around pronouns. You can't just assume if you see someone who is presenting as male that their pronouns, for instance, are he, him. And similarly, if you see someone in a opposite sex relationship, same sex relationship, theoretically, in what you quote unquote see, you can't just make the assumption that you're looking at, two gay men or a man and a woman or whatever, like a heterosexual couple. That may not be what you're looking at. And so, I think part of it's raising that visibility. And Alana, you raise a really good point. There's an invisibility that happens. And what's interesting about some of the work that someone like Sherry does, for instance, is she works to give out, and she'll be at our Pride Festival on Saturday.
Yeah, she will.
Just Sherry's going to get a lot of shout outs tonight because she does so much great stuff in Connecticut in particular. But she gives out little trinkets, bracelets, pins, things that are just a little show of identity. And I've personally worn pins to certain events and things like that, just to make sure that there's that little bit of a something, the flag, or, so people who are looking for the symbols, looking for the bat signal, will find it, and they won't feel alone in the room, and it won't be, the same kind of challenge as if you feel like you're alone and you're not represented.
Well, and Sherry, again, we're going to give Sherry a lot of props tonight. But
Sherry.
no, but Sherry, one of the things that I really like that Sherry leads with a lot of the time is factual based knowledge, right? Like one of the things that Sherry always talks about is the B. And when she says the B, she's meaning it in the context of bi plus, meaning inclusive of pan and other monosexual gender or sexual orientations. It is the largest segment of the LGBTQ plus community, right? And there's so many bi plus folks that are part of various aspects of any LGBTQ movement, any LGBTQ organization, but in so many ways we self-erase them because of assumptions of looking at someone and making a decision on their behalf, right? As you were saying that with the pronouns, it's the same thing. The same thing happens with sexual orientation. People see someone and go, oh, well, that person's gay because they're in a relationship with another cis man, or oh, this happens to my little sister who identifies as bisexual, and she's married to cis man, and they have a baby, and so everyone just assumes that the rest of her sexual identity doesn't exist. So I think there's so many layers of erasure that creates, I think, the invisibility that Alana's talking about. But literally, you could never be in a queer space and not have at least one bi plus person there in some shape or form.
Yeah, and as these surveys come out and they sort of pull the community, as it were, you see the bisexual plus segment of the community just keeps getting bigger and bigger in each successive survey. So there's a lot of people out there, but the community is much less developed in many ways than other parts of the community. Like you could like, if you look at the trans community, for instance, there's such a developing, and it's been evolving and growing community, which is great. You've obviously saw that in the 90s with the gay community, the lesbian community. The bi plus community still has a lot of work to do to sort of bring itself together, and so it can very easily seem like you're by yourself. One thing that's been great is that, for instance, in Connecticut, we have 3 groups that meet monthly now, so it is starting to get stronger from that perspective. But I think there's still a lot more that can be done. There's still a lot of activities. It's like we're on the ground floor. It's like we're really just building a foundation.
Which is crazy on one hand when you think of people like Robin Oakes and the existence of the bi plus civil rights movement, the bi plus the movement of because the first bisexual my brain is not working, but bisexual pride event was, I want to say, in the 70s. And Alana, I left your comment up, Alana, because I want to just share, although it has not been posted online yet because we didn't want it to get lost in all of the pride. But next Friday, we're actually doing a panel conversation for Bi Visibility Week, specifically on the intersection of bi and trans. So it's going to be a panel of all trans folk who also identify as bi plus, whether they're biromantic, pansexual, bisexual, or any of the other non-monosexual sexual orientations. So I just wanted to throw that out, and that's why, Alana, I left your comment up for so long. And Sarah had a question, Josh, is whether or not demisexual was listed on your survey.
I don't recall that being there either, actually.
I don't remember that being there either, because you sent me the screenshot.
Yeah, there was a good 15 choices on there, so it was not the most thorough, but it was at the same time interestingly thorough for what it was. It wasn't just like a standard gender question. So I thought that was just interesting in approach, and I liked the idea of the approach. I just didn't like the final list that they came up with. I felt it was, for what it was, they made a very incomplete list, and they could have done a better job. And I try to look at things practically. I understand that people continue to evolve and get better, and over time this will improve. For instance, when in some of the bi plus groups, we've been talking about how bi visibility overall, bi representation seems to be growing quite a bit. I was very pleased with the amount of sort of instances of really positive bi representation I was seeing during Pride Month, for instance, this year, which I don't recall seeing in that volume in the past. But there's always more that can be done. What's the next step? How can we improve this? And so,
Right.
I like to applaud when people are going in the right direction, but also at the same time, I did check other and typed in bisexual because I want to make sure that they knew that they messed up. So that way they can hopefully fix it for the future.
Well, and I think it's interesting because the bi plus community is so broad, and bi plus umbrella has many identities and orientations under it, and to Alana's point, there's also segmentation that happens where somebody may have to choose, is my identity as a trans person the identity that is being led with, I think of us having in the spring, we did a program with a very prominent transgender Black woman, and you talk about transgender Black woman, but she's also a bisexual transgender Black woman, right? And so when there might be multiple identities, and this is where I think bi-erasure in the community happens more so than out externally. Or we had during Pride Month, I'm forgetting everybody's name right now because I've been at work since 7 a.m. But we had, oh gosh, what is her name? She's a Muslim woman and she's bisexual and speaks very publicly, but again, is often recognized as queer woman, not as bisexual woman, right? And so I think, I don't know, Josh, do you have any thoughts for someone who might be watching this that may be a leader in the community or maybe creating copy or writing about the community? How can they be better about not falling into that trap?
Well, I think it's something that's difficult, right? Because Patrick and I had a conversation. I was trying to figure out how we could be more able to promote the amount of bi plus efforts that we have actually going on at the center. Because, for instance, I think one year we had more than 50% of our artists fell under the bi plus umbrella. But most of the artists did not have bi plus anything anywhere on their bios or anything like that. So I think even just the most practical thing is even just being able to include it somewhere in passing. Again, I think, those little signals, those little signs just help underscore and frankly normalize the ability for people to include that as part of their identity. And I think that's really one of the simplest things that we can do. And that's how you push back on bi erasure is you just don't let it get erased out of the bio. You don't let it get it completely disappearing. And I think that's just a small step that can help really people see it going on day to day in their community.
Exactly. And I want to give Devin, who just commented, a shout out. They're going to be on our panel next week with the trans and bi program. So,
fantastic!
They'll also be on our non-binary panel on Thursday. But
very good.
But no, and I think that's right, because I think there is, and that's not something we're necessarily doing, right? Like but there's ways that we can encourage folks that when they are submitting bios that they think about including that,
Yeah, and so I'm trying to remember back. This might have even come up when we had our conversation with Zachary Zane last year. Maybe I saw something elsewhere that he was involved in the conversation. But unfortunately, when it comes to things like the bi plus label, sometimes people just jump right to the sexual aspect of it, and that's not necessarily even what people are trying to put forth about their identity, and so that's sometimes why they might push that down. And whereas being queer or being a person of color or whatever the case may be, it may be more important to lead with for lived experience, overall. And so I think that might be part of it, but I think again it's just about the representation and the overall presentation, and it's complicated, and I hate to judge what one person wants to do over another. That's not my place. But for me, I just try to have a little something there to help indicate it and show that there's someone in the room.
Yeah, well, and to Sherry's point about kind of it being bi plus umbrella, bi plus community being the largest segment of the larger LGBTQ plus community. When you look at least at Pride New Haven, I don't want to generalize to all prides, but when I look at Pride New Haven, we certainly see more and more, a lot of the younger generation, the kind of, I would say 14, 15 to like 22, 25, often wear like pride flags as their capes at Pride. And you see, I mean, particularly pansexual is becoming, I would say, the most worn. Pansexual and asexual seem to be the most commonly seen that I see at prides,
Yeah.
Or at our pride, maybe I should say. But I think it's true. There are more and more, I think as we continue to elevate these kinds of conversations, more and more people, signal, right?
And I think, like many things with our community over the past, X number of years, there's also a little bit of a generational thing that goes on. I remember when I first joined the center 15 years ago, one of the first things I did was I took over for their previous designer, and they needed envelopes printed up, and I put what at the time was New Haven Gay and Lesbian Community Centers. Like, no, we have to throw all those envelopes out, because you can't be sending things that say gay and lesbian out home to people who may not be out to their families and things like that. And so there was, and I think even to this day, some of our envelopes still just say NHPC. Frankly,
they all say that. I have one right here. I'm dropping everything. They still say there it is, NHPC.
Yeah. But like, some of these things were done because, different people are in different places, and you do see definitely, for the younger generation in particular, there's definitely an evolution that's happened where there's much more, the identities are being declared earlier and more proudly and loudly. And, I still talk to people who, in the Bi Plus group, who's in their 50s, and they're like, I'm just coming to terms with this. I sort of pushed it aside for 20 years. I thought, oh, maybe this was not, they thought themselves it was just a phase, right? And then came to realize later on that they were putting a part of themselves aside. So I always am excited to see sort of that evolution, because I know that means that, it's just better days ahead for many, and hopefully less challenges and less objections and less pushback in the community. Because when I hear these stories, it's very, very painful, and and you kind of feel it yourself, because many times the stories you're hearing are things you've lived yourself, and so you just don't want to see that for the next group. You want everybody to kind of be able to benefit from the work that came before it.
Well, and I think particularly when we think of visibility at our pride in particular, because I don't want to generalize to other folks, but I mean, Sherry always says, I would say Sherry's table is usually one of the busiest of the vendors. I mean, Sherry's not there as a vendor, but as a category of activities, she, for better or for worse, is considered a vendor.
She's vending free stuff. Yes,
vending free stuff, exactly. But she's one of our most visited tables every pride, and I think as language has evolved for how we talk about the broadness of the Bi Plus umbrella, right? As we kind of define language better, as we develop language better. 10, 15 years ago, most of the language we use now to talk about Bi Plus identities didn't exist, or existed in vacuums of either academia or intercommunity, smaller communities. And as those identities, those knowledge, that language becomes more and more commonplace, I think people are finding ways that they identify more connected to that umbrella, or rediscovering their own, the way they think of themselves. I mean, that happens with my partner, who, for the sake of this conversation, is under the Bi Plus umbrella. He doesn't like any of the terms, so he just kind of is under the umbrella without a label, which is valid, and everybody else can also feel free to do that. But I think the evolution of language has really helped a lot of people really connect in a different way.
Yeah, and I think we've also been able to get more sophisticated in our conversations as a community, right? And especially now that there's things like intersectionality, like as we were talking about earlier with being trans and bi, and that can be a difficult thing for people to wrap their heads around. Although it shouldn't, because they're separate concepts, but it's for whatever reason, intersectionality in general just seems to throw people a curveball. And so this is part of the work that we do through the center all the time, is not just elevating one group, but like elevating combined groups, intersectional groups, and, like in all the different layers of how things come together, because there's shared experiences across different groups because of these intersectionality scenarios. So I think that you're right. Like, I think it's becoming easier to have these conversations, in part because the language has evolved, but it's also become easier because we're able to have a more sophisticated conversation about this as a group. And the hope over time is that, again, more visibility, more education, and we'll just continue to evolve and improve, and hopefully over time it becomes sort of easier for people to understand and to support.
Yeah. Well, and I think, we say intersectional, and one of the best examples of a super intersectional program that we did at the center this past June was we did a conversation called, it was during our Day of Action, and it was called The Complexity of Black Sexuality. And it was specifically about this intersectional world of being a Black person and being a queer person. And I think everyone on that panel, if I'm remembering correctly, it was a very big panel. There was, I think, 6 people on it. And everyone on it was somewhere in the gray area of non-monosexual, right? And anybody who's watching, if you're not familiar with the term monosexual, it's been slowly becoming more popular, but monosexual refers to someone who identifies as straight, gay, lesbian, essentially as a attraction to a single gender identity. And so the conversation was and it lived in that intersectionality. And I think, Alana just said the future is intersectionality, and I think you're right. And so I think that
spot on.
Very true. And Renee, I see your question. I'm going to pop up both of them, but we would love for your wife and you to be a part of this. And I'm not knowing which event you mean. I will once again pop up where is it? If you do go to newhavenpridecenter.org/2021 Pride, that has all of our Pride events. Saturday is Pride Fest, which is the event where Sherry will be, that we've been mentioning. And then next week, we are going to be doing a whole series of programs for Bi Visibility Day, which is next Thursday, although we are going to have programs on either side of that day.
And I'm really excited particularly about that because while we've done Bi Plus programming for Pride Month and we've done it for Pride Week here, this will be the first time where we have a full slate for Bi Visibility Day /week. Something we've been intending on doing for a while. We just needed to get things lined up, but it will also kick off. Should we talk about it now?
Sure. Do you want to announce it or do you want me?
So we're going to be having. I'll kick it off and then you can get into the details because you know the details slightly better than I do at this point. We're going to be kicking off a more consistent series of Bi Plus programming that's going to be on the calendar on a pretty steady cadence going forward. And so every 4 weeks ish, we'll say, there'll be sort of a new topic and new conversation. So so those of you know, we've done this with other sort of parts of our community as we've been building out our program officers and so forth. But this is now just expanding it to cover the Bi Plus umbrella. So did you want to talk a little more about that?
Yeah, and I'm gonna mention 2 new series because I see them as very interconnected. So the first is Bi Talks, which is tonight. This is the first of what will be a series of conversations. Our hope is to have them monthly, but sometimes it may be only 3 weeks, sometimes it may be longer. It's going to be a bit based on the availability of our speakers, but the idea is to bring local voices and bring national voices together to have conversations that specifically relate to issues that either uniquely concern the Bi Plus community or about, again, this idea of combating erasure, combating, I'll use the word hate, self-hate that happens within our own community, biphobia that happens within our own community. So it's really about kind of twofold, both this idea of like creating Bi Plus spaces to have conversations about Bi Plus issues and concerns of the community, but also this kind of opportunity for non-Bi Plus community members to participate and learn and be more mindful within the way we move through spaces. Yep. The other series that I say is connected, and while it's not specifically a Bi Plus program, this series is also kicking off during Pride Week. It's actually Wednesday, which is decolonizing gender and the idea of how do we take all of the norms of society and decolonize them for ourselves so that we can live in a much more progressively thought and forward society. So the first of this program is actually going to be kicking off with all staff. It's been something we've been working on for so long now, and then it's going to spin off into a series of conversations that affect different parts of our community. I am certain, without a doubt, that one of them will be specifically focused on the Bi Plus community because there is so much existence of Bi Plus identities throughout history that has been repeatedly erased, particularly through colonialism. And so we want to bring a lot of that forward to the community. So those are two, and then there's all of the other programs that we are working towards having a larger presence of within the larger center programming.
Yeah, and one of the things that we've been looking at and been mindful of is that there has been by some prominent bi+ voices in the community, some distrust of some community centers because they say that they support our community and then don't follow through. And so we want to make sure that we're not only following through, but as many of you know, like this program we're doing right now, these live on, they outlast this particular session. It's not like something that happens in a room, is not recorded and then disappears. So we're going to be building a library of content which we hope will help people not just now but later. And so we have our YouTube channel, we have our Facebook page, and so that's a really important aspect of this. This is something when I joined the center 15 years ago, I had it in the back of my head, is like, we need to have a digital archive of our history, but we also need to have a digital archive of our resources. And so if those who are feeling like intimidated and don't want to necessarily have their first trip be showing up in person to pull a pamphlet off the wall, they can learn that the center is a safe space and is offering these resources by going online, right? So that's a big part of this for us as well. And so, like we've done with a lot of our programming since COVID happened, and sort of forced our hands, but in the best way possible, these are going to be very accessible resources in a variety of different ways. And so that's really an exciting part of this for me as well. And building upon what's already in our community in terms of the resources that we have.
Exactly. And I do want to give a shout out to Sherry one more time for actually being the person that arranged for us to have a really beautiful roster of bi+ community brochures here at the center, thanks to the Bisexual Resource Center.
Yes.
But also, I want to give a shout out to the conversation you had with Zachary Zane last summer, which was, I was in the backstage producing it, and it was such a brilliant, amazing conversation. So I definitely recommend checking that out. It is on our YouTube.
Yep.
And so we don't have a lot of time left, Josh. So I do want to actually get to one of the things that we said we were going to talk about, which is bi-erasure within the community.
Yep.
Which I know you and I'm going to say this. I say this in a good way. I know you have a lot of thoughts and opinions about this, for very good reasons. But I think for me, the biggest question that I have as a monosexual is what are and a monosexual with a bi+ partner, mm-hmm. what are things that I can do to combat bi-erasure that might happen in my own home, right? Because we're just the two of us there, so that means it's coming from me if it's happening. So what is something, I know you have been in a long-term relationship, you've had multiple relationships, but what's something that would be helpful to you as a partner to make sure that we're not contributing to the global problem?
I mean, the number one thing I would say is what I would say for about any part about being in a relationship, which is being supportive of the person that they are, right? So, just like we're thoughtful about other things about people's aspects of people's lives, and are getting increasingly so as the world evolves, it's about just being respectful of that. It's not knocking down the bisexual or the bi+ or the pan or whatever label or not label in the case of your partner, right, happens to be, and being supportive of that, right? Obviously we have a lot of the tropes about bi+ people are greedy or they can't make up their minds or things like that. And obviously in your case, for instance, they've certainly made up your mind because you're together, right? So clearly that worked out just fine, and there doesn't seem to be an issue there, right? So obviously, that respect that a relationship has is very supporting, right? Like, the fact that you're able to have a strong relationship is supporting in that way. And so, it's I think that's a big, Alana once again hits the nail on the head. It's not this, and this is what I was saying earlier. Being bi+, people jump right to the sexual aspect of things, but like that's just really an unfair scenario, right? You're putting a bunch of assumptions on a person where you barely have any idea. You probably didn't even know they were bi until they said something, or they were pan until they said something, right? So it's like you're just throwing a bunch of stuff at them that's not really their burden to bear, right? So I think that's the thing. I think it's about being supportive of the identity, being supportive of just who they are as a person, just in general, right? Like they're just like you'd be supportive of hobbies, or you'd be supportive of other things. I think that's it's just a piece of who they are, and it's a lovely piece of who they are. It's just part of what makes them special.
Yeah, and I think for me, one of the things that I always struggle to balance is the idea of wanting to not erase, in the case of my partner, his identity and his sexual orientation, while also not wanting to kind of label him and or out him in environments that he doesn't necessarily want to be outed, but also wanting to make sure that I'm correcting someone who's erasing that part of his identity by just assuming, oh, he's just a gay man, blah, 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 because he's with me, right?
Right. And I think so that's one of those conversations you have together, right? So like, if he's feeling uncomfortable constantly having to out himself, right? Like one of the things about being bi plus is you're constantly coming out to people. And Zachary Zane sort of has a really good piece that he wrote a while ago about, like, do you really want to be coming out forever, et cetera. But like, it's unfortunately part of the thing because of the invisibility of the bi plus community and because of the accepted sort of expectations when you see certain things like, two people together and what that means, right? And so, I think that that's a good conversation to have. It's like, if we're in these situations, you want to be the one that do you want to own this yourself, or do you want my help, right? Like that's being part of being a couple, right? Like it's just like, oh, you had a really bad interaction with someone at work. Do you need support, or you got this covered, right? Like I think it's the same kind of thing. It's just another layer to that, and I think that is something that you discuss together and you work together on, right? That's part of the way you can be supportive.
Yeah, no, and you're right. And I think that, it goes back to my years of kind of having the what's the word I'm looking for? Allah and I talk about this a lot. Allah, for anybody who doesn't know, is our youth program officer and one of the founders of Black Lives Matter New Haven. And this idea that as a non-Black person, there's levels of emotional work I need to do to support my friends. As a cisgender person, there's a role that I have to play to correct someone who's misgendering someone I'm with, right? And particularly if they're doing it on purpose. Right. But it's also, there is that also balance of like, you don't want to necessarily out someone if they don't want to go through the series of emotional labor that may come out of that outing, even in a friendly environment. So.
But now if we take that a step further, because you raise a really interesting point about the purposeful misgendering, for instance, if your partner sort of puts the correct expectation out there, and then someone's like, oh, you're in a phase, or no, you're not, because look who you're with. Like, you can then calmly but helpfully sort of correct that again, right? So it's not just on your partner alone to have to do this constantly, because for better or worse, when you reveal your identity, when you come out, there will be a percentage of people who just don't accept it or don't believe it. And that's where it gets a little tougher, right? And especially when it's happening in safe spaces like, your LGBTQ bars, where I've seen it happen many times, where it happens in safe spaces, where it's supposed to be, people who are friendly to the entire community. That's when it gets a little tougher. And so, like when you have scenarios like, oh, you're not bi, you're a gay man, it's just a phase. Or, I've certainly seen, I've had examples come to me over the years where, someone who's lesbian rejects a bisexual person because they're not, I don't know, you want to use the gold star, whatever term it is, right? And so, these are all challenges that are still facing the community. These are all walls that we encounter within what's supposed to be a community that supports each other. And so I think that as another thing that you could be possibly there to support, because obviously if you're supporting your partner, you're also supporting the identity of your partner. And that means, you can take some of the pressure off if you're encountering a scenario that's less than friendly.
Well, and I think that's true for friends too. And I say that as someone who has done that in environments with you, where I've watched someone brush off when you make a comment about being bisexual or correct someone when they call you gay.
Yep.
And it, it is important. And I think it's just as important as the issue around pronouns or any other aspect of someone's identity that someone might be brushing off in front of you to be supportive. And, you just said something, and I'm gonna, with our last 5 minutes here, I'm gonna open a can of worms.
Okay.
but you talked about the idea of like someone rejecting a partner because they identify in the bi plus umbrella versus as a monosexual. And I do think that in our community, a big part of the bi erasure and internal biphobia, because I think a lot of the bi erasure, and Sherry and I have had this conversation before, a lot of the bi erasure is based ultimately in biphobia versus just kind of ignorance.
Yes.
I think their big chunk of it also comes out of this undeserved resentment that some monosexuals within the community have towards bisexual people. This idea of like, oh, well, you can hide within the straight community because you have access to this part of your sexuality that I don't. Blah, blah, blah. Like this weird resentment. And I just want to put it out there that like that is a demon that you need to work on if you are feeling that. And I think that every queer monosexual, because I don't think straight people is necessarily the same thing, but I think there is a pinch of that resentment that we all, it's like the idea of like internalized racism and bias. I think we all have a little bit of that. So I say that to open a can of worms in our last 5 minutes, that I hope that as we continue to do these bi talks, that we can uncork that a little bit more and talk through why that resentment is so not only toxic within the community, but very misplaced.
I agree. And the other thing that I think is part of the challenge is that it's sort of like a record skipping, right? Because you can have these conversations 100 times, but then person 101 will come around and you'll just go all over again. And there was a period of time, I mean, if I'm being honest, where I didn't really work to correct the record as aggressively because it was so exhausting and it happened so often. And it's like, do I really want to do this again right now? I'm just trying to relax and have a good night out with friends. And like, here's another idiot who just wants to sort of discard what I'm telling them, even though I'm giving them the direct information straight from the horse's mouth. And so, but I think I've become a bit more persistent again because of the fact that like, I don't think it should be accepted. And I think that it needs to be tackled head on. And I think I've also sort of just seen it happen to people around me enough too, that I just get very frustrated on their behalf and it just needs to stop. And so, that's why I'm really happy that we're going to be doing even more over the next year. But I do want to, I know we're going to go a minute or two over, but I did want to mention a couple of quick things that are existing now. So first of all, I mentioned earlier, there are 3 groups in the state that meet monthly. One is run through the Triangle Community Center at the beginning of each month. One is run through the center at the end of each month. And then Sherry, back to Sherry, is resuming her group soon up in Middletown. All 3 groups are currently meeting with some virtual component, although there is some seemingly moves to start to move back some in-person opportunities, but I believe the virtual piece will be available for all 3 groups for the time being concurrently with an in-person piece. If you're looking for the details of that, we also have a Facebook group called Bisexual Plus Connecticut, where we share resources, share positive, happy memes. Hopefully people connect a little bit and can make friends throughout the community, but that exists as well. And then also one of our other friends of the center, her name is Sheila Lambert. She runs the Bi Writers Association, which does the Bisexual Book Awards every year. They announced their 2021 awardees earlier this summer. They are going to be starting an author talk series pretty soon online as part of a move to doing some year-round programming. So we'll share that through our various pages when that's coming out as well. But there's so many great Bi plus representations in books nowadays, nonfiction, fiction, that if you're looking for some literature and you want to do some reading and sort of explore it further, the lists that they put out every year are really good, both the candidates as well as the winners. So just some resources to throw out there. There's plenty more than that, but that's just some off the top of my head I wanted to share with a little time we have left.
Yeah, I just shared in the comment section of everybody's, wherever you're watching, whether you're YouTube or Facebook, I just shared the link, the direct link to the Bisexual Connecticut group. And I will, not to say Sherry's name again, but Sherry is really good about posting actually the meeting schedule in that group on a regular basis and links to the accessing the virtual events. And I do want to also give a shout out to the, I'm going to miss their name. The Bisexual Social Network of New York. I don't think that's right.
New
York Area
Area
Bisexual
Bisexual Network. Yes, there we go.
Yes. I also want to give a shout out to them. They are a really great online resource. They're based in New York City. And you can just I think I can pull up there. Yep, I can. I will also share in the comments on all of the platforms their direct link to to their Facebook page.
Yeah, they do a truly tri-state focus. So there's going to be resources that are New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. But most importantly, like many parts of the world right now, there's a lot of things that are happening virtually. So the Bi Plus groups meeting in New York City, for instance, are meeting virtually. So we in Connecticut can attend, which would not necessarily be the thing if you're living up in Hartford and there's a meeting at the center in New York, right? So that's one thing that's been really, if you want to have a silver lining about the move to everybody having to be doing more virtual programming, is that there is a lot more accessibility. And even in our groups, in Connecticut, we've been seeing people from Chicago and Minnesota, and we have someone who's been visiting regularly from England. And so that's exciting too, because again, we're finally building this sort of network of a community and making friends. And Sheila, who I met through our group and gotten to know, who's in New York, who's doing these amazing awards. So, it's great that we get to know each other a little bit in another way too.
Yeah. Well, Josh, as a non-Bi Plus community member, I want to give you the final word in case there's anything else that you want to share and say. Before I do that, I just want to again reiterate that next week for Bi Visibility Day, which is next Thursday, there will be a series of programs that the center is going to do. All of them will be virtual, so you can access them from anywhere, and also watch them later if you're not available when they're happening. And so those will be on our Facebook and our YouTube channels, and we'll be sure to also share the links once they go live into Bisexual Connecticut. And then the Bi Talk series will continue on in October, will be our next one. But anyway, Josh, I want to give you final thoughts, words.
I think the most
brilliant ideas.
The most important thing I want to underscore, aside from you're not alone and that there are the others out there who have been where you are. So if you're struggling, don't hesitate to reach out, come to our groups, come chat with us. But most importantly, also the programming that the center is doing is many times sort of generated based on the feedback we receive from the community. And so I gave Patrick I took notes throughout a few meetings, gave Patrick a laundry list of people, of groups that we should reach out to and try to schedule programming with. I didn't know of more than half of them before it was brought to my attention. So I'm learning of new resources all the time as well, which is always a good problem. But if there's topics that are really on your mind that you'd like to see us cover, if there's angles of support or just things that you'd like to see out of the center, we're listening. As the center grows, we do have on our roadmap, for instance, the ability to add a bi resource officer like we've added for some of the other identities and groups that need sort of this sort of focus. So, we also have sort of future plans to continue to grow this. And so your feedback will just help us figure out the best way to approach this, because your ideas are really helpful so it's not just a couple people thinking about it, we're getting a broad array of thoughts. And so definitely let us know what's helpful for you. And we'll definitely continue to schedule these programs, because we know for us, we really think it's important to do. And we really want to be helpful to as many people as we can.
Well, and with that, I will not take up more airspace, but I do want to thank you, Josh, for not only being a tireless champion of the Pride Center, but specifically a tireless champion within the Pride Center to make sure that bisexual plus community in the bisexual plus umbrella is not one left out in the rain. And I will always do this at the end of any bi program. A massive shout out to Sherry Lucas, who has, I think, more energy than half of us combined. Yes. And really has been a incredibly impactful voice in our Connecticut bisexual plus and queer community for change, for recognition, and against bi-erasure and biphobia, particularly within our own community.
And if you want to meet Sherry, she will be pinch hitting for me at the next meeting, because I'll be out of town. So she'll be running the group in September, which is on the fourth Saturday of every month from 1:30 to 3 p.m. So you can definitely get to know her there, among other things, or meet her on Saturday at our Pride Festival.
Yes. And so with that, I'm going to put up our URL one last time, newhavenpridecenter.org/2021pride. We hope to see you at many more events throughout this week. We go until Sunday, and there is at least 25 more events left. So there is a lot to do and see. And again, Josh, thank you so much for not only all you have done for the center and will continue to do, I know, but particularly this is probably your last public action as president of the board since you are stepping down in 3 weeks. So again, I want to thank you. You've been instrumental to so many moments in the center's history. The largest maybe being the transition to us having a staff, which would not have happened without your leadership. So I just
back at you, because you've been definitely carrying the torch forward very successfully. Mr. I got here at 7 a.m. But also I want to thank everybody who joined us for the conversation today. These wouldn't be successful if we didn't have your participation and joining us here. Obviously, we want to thank you for giving us a little bit of your time today, and we hope to use it wisely both now and in the future.
Yes, and with that, good night, everybody.
Good night.